book after book has been written on the subject, but there's one particular aspect of the problem of evil that is gaining popularity amongst skeptics and unbelievers, and that is the so called problem of animal suffering. In other words, why would a good God create animals and allow them to suffer in so many seemingly horrible and simply meaningless ways? Some people, like Alex O'Connor, who's also known as the Cosmic Skeptic on YouTube, go so far as to claim that this is the single greatest problem to Christianity. So, what exactly is the problem of animal suffering, and how should Christians respond? We'll be discussing this issue with Dr. Kyle Keltz, SAS alum and author of Thomism and the Problem of Animal Suffering. I'm Adam Tucker with Southern Evangelical Seminary, and this is Why Do You Believe? Welcome back to another episode of Why Do You Believe, the podcast and live stream of Southern Evangelical Seminary and Bible College. Thank you for joining us. I hope you're enjoying the weekly content. And as always, I would encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, like our Facebook page. Make sure you get the notifications when we're going live, and be sure to follow us across social media, so you know that you know what's going on. You can find our archived videos and episodes from this show, from our events, from our national conference. You can also download our SES mobile app at ses.edu, where you can get over 500 hours worth of free apologetics content, most of which comes from previous years of our national conference on Christian apologetics. So again, you can find that at ses.edu and click on the media tab, and you can download the mobile app for free. So again, you'll find all of our archived content and information there. So we want to jump right in, break our format just a bit today. We're going to have a slightly different show. I'm going to attempt to play some audio clips, or video clips actually, of Alex O'Connor, who I mentioned in the intro, on the talk that he gave on his YouTube channel on the problem of animal suffering. And we're joined, as I mentioned, let me switch shots here, by Dr. Kyle Keltz. He's not a stranger to the show, so we're happy to have him back, SES alum. He's also a professor in Texas. He's an author, an apologist, and just a great all-around guy. So, Kyle, we're happy to have you back. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me back, Adam. I'm excited to be here today to talk about problem of animal suffering.
Well, I'm excited to have you on. I know recently you have been on the Classical Theism podcast talking about this issue. And you've also, as of the recording of our conversation, you were also interviewed by Matt Fradd on Pints with Aquinas for an episode that is to air, I think, sometime soon about this issue as well. So I'm glad your work is getting out there. I think your position, which is largely built on the Thomistic thought that we talk about a lot on the show, and that we think about a lot at SES, hopefully our listeners and viewers will see just how different that is from the typical evangelical responses that are offered to these types of issues and these types of questions. So what before we get into the video of Alex, what prompted you to really dig into this particular issue?
Oh, well, you know, I don't have really a long origin story or anything with it. It just caught my attention. So, you know, I got the degree in apologetics, Christian apologetics, master degree from SES. And then I decided to stay and get my PhD in philosophy of religion from SES. And when I started in the program, they were encouraging us to start looking into our dissertation topic pretty early on, and then possibly work on that topic in every class and write a bunch of papers on it. So by the time you get to your dissertation, you'll be ready to just, you'll have a good base of knowledge and um, uh, research already to be ready to start on that. And I think it was like the second class I took. I think it was the second class I took in the PhD program was on the problem of evil. And I ran across a book during the coursework or some of my research. I can't remember. It was Michael Murray's Nature Red and Tooth and Claw. And I had never heard of the problem of animal suffering before. And I read all the atheists arguing against theism from animal suffering. I read Murray's take on it, and I thought it was just fascinating. It not only involved philosophical theology, but it also involved the philosophy of animal minds. And I kind of got hooked. And I also thought that, as much as I found some of Murray compelling, found a lot of what he writes compelling, I noticed that I probably I just thought that Thomas Aquinas had the philosophical and metaphysical tools to come up with an even more robust and comprehensive response to the problem. So, and that's what got me started. And it was so strange. I never imagined I'd be studying animal minds in seminary, but a handful of years later, and that's what my dissertation was over.
Nice, nice. Well, I really do think that it is an important work, and uh, like we say so many times on the show, the beauty of the metaphysics and those foundational philosophical concepts that we latch onto and utilize so much at SES not only speak to whatever specific issue, like animal suffering in this case, that we're talking about, but they have such broad implications to so many other issues that you're really using the same tools out of the same toolbox to solve so many of these so-called problems in apologetics or philosophy or whatever the case may be. So I'm excited as to how you're using those tools to this particular issue. So I am going to attempt to share my screen, and we're going to play just about a minute and a half or so of Alex O'Connor, the Cosmic Skeptic, explaining at least his version of the problem of animal suffering. Let's see if we can make this work here. And here we go.
Biggest. So I should probably begin by unpacking why animal suffering is such a problem worth addressing in the first place. If human life is, as I've argued, infused with pain, then non-human animal life is defined by pain. Animals in the wild are subject to endless torment from all angles of their existence. They suffer from predation by other animals. Wild dogs disembowel their prey. Venomous snakes cause slow internal bleeding and paralysis. Crocodiles drown large animals in their jaws. And animals also suffer from rampant disease, dehydration, and starvation. They have to contend with forest fires and floods and a whole manner of other terrifying natural disasters. David Attenborough, the celebrated nature documentary filmmaker, once said about his documentaries, "People who accuse us of putting in too much violence should see what we leave on the cutting room floor." Nature just really isn't a pretty place, and not only do wild animals suffer in these extravagant ways that humans generally do not, like having to live with the very real possibility of being mauled to death at practically any moment, it's also true that compared to humans, an astronomically higher number of wild animals exist. So unfathomably high, in fact, that we can only estimate how big that number actually is. The number of wild vertebrates alone is thought to be somewhere between 10 to the power of 11 and 10 to the power of 14. That's 10 with at least 11 zeros after it. We're talking trillions of animals, each one of whom will, under the unerring supervision of an all-powerful, all-loving God, likely experience more fear, devastation, and suffering in their lifetimes than we human beings are even capable of imagining. So this is the problem.
All right, let's stop it right there. Let me switch screens here and go back to this shot. Hey, I think it worked. Sorry, I know the video wasn't full screen there, but hopefully it still works out okay. Less buttons for me to have to click and and risk messing something up. So I don't know if our viewers can see this, but that video has almost 250,000 views so far from Alex's channel there. So Kyle, problem of animal suffering. What do you think? How what do you think about the way he's laid it out?
I think he did a pretty good job of explaining the problem, because yeah, that's basically what it is. In the history of Western philosophy, it actually hasn't been a problem until like after modern times. I explain this in my book, but they think that it wasn't until people started owning pets. The middle class in Europe and in Western countries started owning pets, that people started really connecting with animals more and worrying about animals more. But also, a handful of things in Western philosophy started going, plus with the advent of Darwinian thought, and more knowledge of the natural history of the earth. That's the problem, is atheists say, if God were all knowing, all loving, and all powerful, then it seems like God wouldn't use millions of years of animal suffering, disease, and death just to make a place for human beings to live. And in my book and in this video, like what I just said, I know within evangelical Christianity, there's a debate between how old the earth is. Some people think it's 6,000 to 10,000 years. Others are thinking it's older. Honestly, that question doesn't matter in this debate. When I'm defending against the problem against the atheists, I'm just assuming the earth is that old. But honestly, it doesn't matter. Because if you think about it, even in 10,000 years, if you think of like Alex pointed out, if you think of the numbers of animals there are in the world, and just think about the fact that every single day they are experiencing pain. Some of them are starving, they're getting diseases, they're dying. So it doesn't matter how long the earth has been around. Animals are suffering and dying every single day. And what the atheists are saying is that it doesn't seem like that would be something that an all-loving, all-powerful, all-good God would allow to happen.
Gotcha. And so I do want, at the end, I do want to engage this issue just briefly from a young Earth perspective, because some of the arguments that Alex is making are very similar to what some young Earth creationists would make, as far as why would a loving God allow cancer in animals and all these things before the fall and those sorts of things. So it's kind of the same argument from a different perspective for the purpose of reaching a different conclusion, but some of the premises are actually very similar. So I do want to put you on the spot with that a little bit at the end, but we'll wait for that. So let's jump into some of the specifics from Alex, and we'll have you respond.
Okay.
So here we have Alex for just about a minute or so here. So hang on, let me jump in and share my screen again. There we go. All right, here we go.
There are many quite famous attempts to reconcile the existence of evil with a loving God. The problem is that a great many of these attempts, which are known as theodicies, by the way, simply don't apply to non-humans. For instance, one popular theodicy states that evil and suffering exists as a result of human free will. Right? If humans are genuinely free, they'll sometimes commit and permit evil. But this doesn't explain why a tree falls onto a deer's leg, causing it to starve to death in confused agony. Right? It's also sometimes asserted that human suffering is justified because it will be compensated for in the afterlife. But unless you believe in some doggy heaven, or that Jesus died for the sake of your pet hamster's sins too, this also doesn't really fly for animals. It's also sometimes said that suffering exists because from it more good can emerge. But what good emerges from animal suffering? And how does it benefit the animals? Most animals are non-rational creatures. They can't learn and intellectually grow in the same way that humans can. What greater good could possibly be served by allowing a koala bear to be burned alive in an Australian wildfire? Well,
Okay, let's stop it right there. And let me get back to the video. So, what greater good could possibly come from animal suffering? And it's interesting. I love the cover of your book. Again, we're talking to Kyle Keltz, Dr. Kyle Keltz, author of Thomism and the Problem of Animal Suffering. So, the cover of your book has, and I don't have a picture to throw up, I'm sorry, but a deer standing in front of a raging forest fire behind this sweet little deer standing there. So, we have a forest fire killing deer and koala bear. We have trees falling on a deer's leg, and he lays there, or she lays there, and suffers. Is this a result of sin? What greater good can come from this? How do you respond to Alex there?
Okay. Well, I wanted to mention more about what he was talking about rather than because here's some of the other clips that we've got ready. I'll get more into the answer to what he's saying. I wanted to, with that clip, I just wanted to focus on what he's saying right now. Because earlier in the video, he said that this is Christianity's number one problem, in his mind, anyways. But he also said that so many, let's see, I had a quote. He said, so many philosophers leave it entirely out of the discussion or at best relegate it to a paragraph or a footnote or something. And then he goes on in this part of the video, and what he's doing, I'm sure you recognize this, Adam. He's saying that traditional theodicies, traditional answers to the problem of evil in general, that includes human beings. Why do human beings suffer? Don't apply to the problem of animal suffering. But I thought this was kind of interesting. But yeah, the first one he mentioned was like a free will theodicy. Evil in the world exists because God wants humans to have free will. And if you have free will, that means it's possible for you to choose good, but it's also possible for you to choose evil. Then he goes on to explain basically a soul-making theodicy. Some people argue that God puts human beings on the earth because he wants us to grow spiritually mature. But if the world was perfect, then we just would never mature because we'd have everything handed to us on a plate. You can't be courageous without danger, right? So that's kind of a soul-making theodicy. And then he mentioned a greater good type theodicy, but he just brushes these away in like a sentence or two each. And while it's true that in general people haven't used in the history of Western philosophy, people haven't used these theodicies to answer the problem of animal suffering. What he's missing, and I found this surprising. I mean, I know he's a YouTuber and he's speaking to a general audience, but I also thought that he was a philosophy student. I mean, not everyone can know everything, right? And I want to be as charitable to him as possible, to Alex as possible. But if you study the problem of animal suffering, you'll find that there are Christian theists who have applied almost every single one of those theodicies to the problem of animal suffering. And almost entire books have been written trying to argue that this is the case and defend it. So it's not all that fair to, one, make it sound like no one's working on this problem, and two, to just brush it away in a sentence or two. Because, I mean, like the free will theodicy, Alvin Plantinga has actually mentioned this. I think it was in Where the Conflict Really Lies. That's one of his more famous works. He mentioned that he thought it was possible that because God wants free will in the universe, maybe Satan and his demons have something to do with animal suffering. So that would actually be a free will theodicy applying. I mean, Alex mentioned human free will, but Plantinga is saying that maybe it's angelic and demonic free will that's causing animal suffering. A soul-making theodicy. There's been 2 or 3 philosophers I know of that have written books arguing that it's possible that God will allow animals to come back in the new creation, and there's one philosopher. His name is Trent Doherty. He wrote let's see, what is his, The Problem of Animal Pain, a Theodicy for Creatures Great and Small. He argues for a soul-making theodicy in which animals are resurrected in the new creation, and they're allowed to look back on the part that they played in the whole grand scheme of things, and that can possibly help in a type of soul making for them. So I just I thought it was unfortunate that he made it sound like no one's really working on it, and that these traditional theodicies don't apply. So, like I said, in the history of Western philosophy, they haven't, like Aquinas, Augustine, and Irenaeus, these types of philosophers weren't trying to answer animal suffering because it wasn't a problem back then. There weren't atheists arguing from animal suffering. But in contemporary times, now that we're arguing this a lot of Christian philosophers have tried to apply those to it. And I just don't think you can brush them away in a couple sentences like he tried to do. And yeah, did you have another clip where he brings up William Lane Craig?
Yeah, I think that's our next clip.
Okay. Yeah, so, if you could play that. I was going to say a little bit more about other philosophers and their works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Alex, with reason, holds up Dr. Craig as kind of the example of Christian apologetics in general, and uses him as his main example in this. Granted, this is only about a 20-minute video that he put together, but uses him as his main example as an antagonist, as you put it, for his argument. So this is a very short clip, but let's go ahead and play this. Let me share the screen again. We're about to get the hang of this here.
Fear not, because in 2011, two very eloquent philosophers, Stephen Law and William Lane Craig, both previous guests on this channel, by the way, debated God's existence. Dr. Law brings up the problem of animal suffering, and so we can now turn our attention to what Dr. Craig, often cited as Christianity's greatest public defender, has to say about it.
Now, okay, so we're just going to stop it there for the moment. Again, we don't want to take anything out of context. We want to answer Alex as charitably as we can and within as much context as possible. So, Kyle, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, yeah, and that's just what he was doing. Now, I'd like to say that I don't make YouTube videos. Obviously, I don't have subscribers like Alex does, and I don't make content on a regular basis, so I don't know what all goes into that. But I mean, he does have a point. William Lane Craig has, a lot of people would say that he's one of the number one apologists in contemporary times. However, I was surprised that he used William Lane Craig as his antagonist. Because to my knowledge, I mean, I think William Lane Craig, besides that debate, wrote about the problem of animal suffering in a blog post for Reasonable Faith a time or two. And every time he does, he mentions Michael Murray. That's what I was wanting to get at was, now, another thing too, trying to be charitable, is that I think it's becoming cliche. When you read an article about the problem of animal suffering, like 5 or 10 years ago, almost everybody would start their article by saying, problem of animal suffering hasn't been answered. Almost no one's working on this issue, and the traditional theodicies don't work. And I still see some people writing that at the beginning of their article, and I think it's time for philosophers, whether you're an atheist or a theist, to stop saying that. Because at this point, so much research and so much literature has been written on the problem of animal suffering. I don't think I would have a problem making a semester-long class on the problem of animal suffering by itself. But yeah, that's one thing I wanted to touch on. There are several. I already mentioned a couple, but there are several, a good handful of philosophers, Christian philosophers, have written entire books on the problem of animal suffering. And that's why I was just kind of surprised that he used William Lane Craig as his example. Now, I was wondering if he used him because he said it in the debate and it was easy to make into a video. But like I said, I mean, so like in my mind, the number one book on the problem of animal suffering has been Michael Murray, Nature Red and Tooth and Claw. I already mentioned him.
I thought you were going to say Thomism and the Problem of Animal Suffering by Dr. Kyle Keltz.
Oh yeah, that's a groundbreaking work that just came. No, well, I mean, I think of Michael Murray as the godfather of answering the problem of evil from animal suffering because I'm forgetting what year this came out, but it was 2009. I don't want to say it because I forgot, but he wrote that, and for me, that I feel like that got a lot of the ball rolling. But I'll talk about this here in a second. But he talked about the philosophy of animal minds. He talks about several options that are open to theists on considering what animals are actually experiencing when they experience pain. And he talks about what is it, gnomic regularity type theodicy, where he wasn't necessarily doing a theodicy where he's trying to give a comprehensive answer, but he was trying to just defend theism from the logical problem of evil. So he's just trying to provide a possible logical explanation for why God would allow animal suffering. And one of his answers was, well, it's like that order. God needs an ordered universe type explanation where he says, well, if God is going to put human beings in the universe, he needs an orderly universe so that human beings will know when he's trying to talk to them, and so on and so forth. If the universe isn't orderly with natural laws, if we're going to be moral agents and there's not regularity, then that's not really going to be conducive to us having real responsibility, and so on and so forth. Right about the same time that Michael Murray wrote that book, Christopher Southgate, a Christian theologian, came out with a book called, was it The Groaning of Creation, I believe? Yeah, The Groaning of Creation. I would say that Christopher Southgate is maybe, definitely compared to SCS, he's more on the liberal side of things. He argues that the Trinity is co-suffering with creation, and he kicked around the idea that maybe using evolution was the only way God could create it. I could just go on and on. There's Nicola Hoggard Cregan wrote a book called Animal Suffering, the Problem of Evil. She uses kind of a free will defense, saying that maybe it's Satan or some kind of evil force that's causing animal suffering. We've already mentioned young earth creationists have that more traditional fall theodicy where they think that animal suffering comes about because Adam and Eve sinned, so God included death in creation at that point. And then, Trent Doherty wrote an entire book, what is The Problem of Animal Pain, and he used that more soul-making theodicy. So I just wanted to put this, I was hoping this would get out there. There are a ton, not a ton, there's a lot of good, well thought out Christian answers to the problem of evil, problem of animal suffering at this point, way beyond what Dr. Craig mentions in this video. So I think people need to, if you're interested in the problem, dig into some of these authors because they've got a lot to provide. Oh yeah, and of course I forgot to mention I wrote a book called Thomism: The Problem of Animal Suffering, where I tackle the problem from a Thomistic perspective. I look at animals from a Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy of mind, and I tackle the problem of why God would create the world He does from a Thomistic, like a Neoplatonic argument that Aquinas has. So there's plenty of stuff out there, and it's more than just William Lane Craig mentioning this in a debate against Stephen Law. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And in the context of Alex's video here, he goes on to play a few clips from the debate with Craig and Law. And Craig is...
Okay, yeah. And in his response to Craig, I just wanted to mention a few things. I know we don't have time to cover, what I would fully answer the problem of animal suffering, but in his response to Craig, I just wanted to bring out a few things.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So
So Craig brings up the issues similar to what you mentioned a while ago with the orderliness of creation and how ecosystems need predators to keep prey populations in check and avoid starvation and these sorts of things. So jump to another clip of Alex responding to those basic ideas.
But are we expected to believe that God couldn't have made these laws differently? Is God constrained by these laws? That's the implication of saying that an ecosystem must be balanced in this way, that God couldn't have created a balanced ecosystem using other, less painful methods. In other words, the laws of ecosystems somehow constrain what God is able to do. Are we really to think that the laws of ecosystems are more fundamental than God is? No.
Okay, so let me switch screens again here. So basically, what is going on is Craig had argued that predators keep, in this case, wolves in Canada were keeping, I think, caribou populations in check that prevented starvation from the larger population and overfeeding on vegetation and those sorts of things. So it was this check and balances sort of thing. And of course, Alex is saying, really, that's the best God can do in his goodness and omniscience. So, what are your thoughts about that?
yeah, well, that's where I think he could Alex could benefit from reading some of the. I mean, even if he just read, even if he just read Murray, Nature Red in Tooth and Claw. I wrote about this in my book as well. So, and I didn't check out the wider context of the debate that Alex was showing. William Lane Craig, like you said, mentioned something about when you watch the video, he just says that, well, research shows that if you pull the predators out of the ecosystem, the prey oftentimes will they're benefiting from the predation. It seems if you take the predators out of the picture, the herd or whatever population that's being preyed upon will have overpopulation and more starvation and things like that. So not only the ecosystem as a whole, but the populations actually benefit from being preyed upon. And Alex says, well, that just seems absurd because it sounds like you're limiting God to the laws of ecosystems. And I don't know. I feel like, again, I didn't look at the larger context, so I don't know what else Dr. Craig said, but I'm pretty sure that Dr. Craig is not saying that God is bound by some kind of ecosystem logic. Because especially since I know Craig talks about Murray in his response to law, what Michael Murray would say is, well, he had a couple of ideas on it. Maybe that he had like a chaos to order theory, but also what he called a gnomic regularity defense, where he argues that God, probably for several good reasons, needs to make a universe ran by natural, orderly laws that are consistent. You know what I'm saying? So I don't think Craig was saying that God has to make ecosystems that are preyed upon, and like there's some necessity out of that. I think Craig was just pointing out the fact that the atheist is saying that the animal predation is bad, but he's just pointing out, given the world that we see, we know that in this case, animal predation actually has benefits. So it's at least not all bad. But I think that's what I'm saying is I think Alex would benefit from reading some of this material, because that's in the context of a wider debate where theists are trying to give reasons for why God would make a world with animals that could die in the first place. You know what I mean? And they have reasons for arguing that God would make a finite world ran by natural laws. And in this world, if you're going to be a contingent being in there, you're going to be subject to pain. You're going to be subject to death. So maybe that's one reason why God does allow that. In my book, I mention, I follow Aquinas in the Summa Contra Gentiles. He has a Neoplatonic argument that God must make a hierarchy of beings. It's really interesting. Of course, I would say that I wrote my dissertation on it, but I found it so interesting because, Aquinas has this whole argument that God can't make a best possible world. One thing I found interesting was that Aquinas pointed out that since God is infinite, God can't make an infinitely good world. Only God is infinite goodness itself. But if you think about it, and I think Craig would agree on this because in his arguments, his Kalam argument, he argues you can't have an actual infinite amount of something in reality. So if you think about that, if it is true that we can't have an infinitely large world, any world that God is gonna create is gonna be finite, right? And yeah, I mean, I don't even have to get into all of the Thomistic arguments, like whether you follow Murray or Aquinas. If you're going to make a finite world, and you want to be talking to rational beings within this world, and you also want those beings to have moral responsibility, it's going to behoove you to run this world according to orderly, regular, natural laws, so that everything makes sense to them. If the world runs this one way all the time, whenever God is breaking into reality to speak to human beings, then they're going to realize that, hey, maybe this is from God because only God could do this miracle or something like that, right? And if we do have natural laws, our actions are going to have consequences. It won't just be willy-nilly. So, I mean, I actually agree with Alex that God isn't bound by the laws of ecosystems, but I just think he's missing the bigger picture and ignoring the arguments for why we think God would make a world ran by natural laws in the first place.
I love how Brian Davis paraphrases Aquinas. And of course, I'm paraphrasing Brian Davis here. So a paraphrase of a paraphrase, but he says something to the effect that, could God make a world without lions and lambs? Yeah, sure. But he can't make a world with lions and lambs without lambs having something to worry about, because that is just the nature of a lion, to prey on the lamb, so to speak, which kind of gets to what you're saying there with, God could always do one more thing that reflects his goodness in creation, or prevent one less thing that is a privation of that goodness. But you can never reach that infinite goodness because that is only present in himself.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's a couple of things going along with what you just said, Adam, that I touched on in the book. For one, I don't want to go too long, make the video too long, but Aquinas has an argument that him and other medieval philosophers were dealing with. They were wondering why God created anything in the first place. If God is infinite goodness, why would he make anything to begin with? Because he doesn't need anything. And long story short, they concluded that God creates because God is love, and love isn't something that you want to just keep to yourself. They concluded that the reason why God would make anything would be to share his love and to communicate his goodness, to share his goodness with other beings. And it really goes along. It goes well with traditional Christian theology. You ask, why did God create in Sunday school? Because it's been in catechisms for so long. People say to glorify himself, which is pretty much it's pretty much the theological way of saying that God creates to communicate his goodness. So if God wants to create to show beings and to his love and his goodness and to share his love, that's where the Neoplatonic argument was coming in that Aquinas makes, where he says, because the reason why God is creating is to communicate who he is, it makes sense that he would make a world with a diverse array of creatures and things, all the way down to inanimate objects, all the way up to human beings. But in between that hierarchy, you've got all sorts of amazing, beautiful, smart, powerful, gracious animals. And these are all different ways that God is showing that finite creatures can participate in being, but they all these different animals and plants and just beautiful landscapes. It all just shows you these things that are pointing to God, like metaphysically pointing upwards to God. All these perfections that things in creation have, God has all that beauty, all that perfection to an infinite degree. So that was where Aquinas was coming from, and again, any world God's going to make has to be finite, can't be infinite, so it's going to have a certain amount of resources.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another thing is, like obviously, anyone who's touched on the like we teach at the seminary, and anyone who's researched the problem of evil goes, there's a logical problem of evil, and then there's an evidential problem of evil. And I just wasn't sure what Alex was touching on throughout the video. I didn't know if he was trying to make a statement like a logical statement or an evidential statement. But that's why I thought it was so puzzling that he says that it's the number one problem for Christianity, because if you take the problem logically to say that it's incoherent, to say that God is all loving, all good, all powerful, and animal suffering exists, like we're talking about the problem of animal suffering, like it's a logical problem.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's a logical problem whatsoever, because Christianity as a system, you look at Genesis, so there's the young earth way of looking at it, where they say that the whole world was a paradise. And then Adam and Eve sinned, and then that's when animal death and death itself just entered creation. So that's when all animals and everybody died. But the more I look at this problem, I think a different take on this is there too, though. I've been studying biblical theology, thinking about the problem of animal suffering, and there's a growing consensus, I think, among biblical theologians, or at least there's a good amount of them, who are arguing that it wasn't a worldwide paradise. Within the Garden of Eden, there probably wasn't any death, and if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, they wouldn't die. But they think that outside the Garden of Eden, there was animal death, and the world was just like we see it today. And they think that when God was commanding Adam and Eve to spread across the globe, they think that was basically God asking human beings to expand the borders of the Garden of Eden to encompass the whole earth, so that if they accomplished their mission, they would have been, working alongside God the whole time, and they would have been learning about him and walking alongside him, and he would have been helping them, just like he helped the Jews take over the promised land or something, supernaturally. But all they had to do was follow his one rule, right? But anyways, when they sin, they get kicked out of his presence, because you can't be in the presence of a holy God as a sinner. So anyways, they get kicked out of his presence, but they still have to, they're still under the first Great Commission to be fruitful and multiply. But now they don't have God's help. So now they're just stuck out in the world, and so on and so forth. But anyways, Christianity provides, whether you look at that from that perspective, where just the garden was a paradise or it was a worldwide paradise, Christianity is a system. I don't see any contradiction there. Animal death, whether you're just delaying the consummation of the earth, if Adam and Eve would have obeyed, then and they would have spread across the globe, everything would look like Revelation 20 right now, and it'd be perfect. Or if you look at it from, it was a worldwide paradise to begin with, animal suffering and human suffering actually is a punishment for Adam and Eve's sin. So it's not like Christianity. I just wanted to say Christianity is not saying that God put us on the earth to be happy and never die, because it seems like a lot of atheists think that's the case. But Christianity does not say that. It says that God put us here because he wants to share his love with us. He wants to be in relationship with us, but we can't be in his presence if we are sinful. And that's what you see in the Bible. And that's one of the reasons why we have animal suffering today still. So I just don't see a logical problem with animal suffering and Christianity, because it's not only not contradictory, it actually gives you a full explanation for why we have animal suffering in the first place.
Mm-hmm. I
So
agree with you. We could have a entire semester long course on all the rabbit trails that splinter off from this issue. So let's jump into just a few more clips from
okay,
Alex,
yeah.
and here he's getting into a bit of an abductive argument from evil. So let me once again share the screen, and we'll get this clip going.
Expect to find if we assume that there is no God, and animals in nature are just randomly mutating and evolving and competing for resources with no divine guidance. Well, we'd expect pretty much exactly what we observe in the real world, a messy bloodbath and a struggle for survival. Now, what would we expect to see if we assumed the existence of an all-loving and all-powerful God? Maybe some level of suffering that we might not be able to fully explain, but nothing even remotely approaching the level of horror and pain that actually exists in the natural world. It is incalculably easier to account for this suffering on an atheistic worldview.
Now, let me.
All right, man. I will say I'm being facetious here, but I am impressed at how much Alex knows exactly what God, an omniscient God, would and should do in all of his creation. He is a smarter man than myself. That is for sure.
Oh man, well, I will say this, this more abductive form, this is actually, so throughout the video at first, having studied the problem, I'm sitting there thinking, is he coming at this problem from a logical perspective, saying that Christianity is internally incoherent, or is he just doing a more general evidential argument? Well, that clip right there, that actually is a really great way of putting there's a philosopher named Paul Draper who has made arguments from evil and arguments from the problem of animal suffering, against theism, using this abductive form. And what he'll do is he'll say, okay, forget logical problems. Let's treat this problem like a science experiment, and let's do predictive power. So let's say this is what we'd expect to see upon theism. This is what we'd expect to see upon atheism. And let's test and see what the world looks like and which one has the more explanatory power. That's basically what Alex was stating there. And this has been one of my favorite arguments to interact with. Because for one, and that's one of the things that blew me away with Aquinas's argument, that that medieval idea that if God is going to create anything, it's to communicate his goodness. Okay. But if you're going to communicate something, there needs to be someone who's going to get the communication, right? So if God is going to create anything, it's going to be to communicate his goodness. But that means he's got to create rational beings, beings who can know who he is and choose to love him back. If he wants to share his love, communicate his goodness, any world God creates, Christianity basically is predicting that it's going to have sentient, self-aware beings, rational beings in it. And whenever I kind of put two and two together with what Aquinas was saying and how Draper was going about it, I realized that, for one of the things that Christianity predicts is that God is going to make a finite world. It's going to have, only so many resources on it. I know God could do other things, but this is kind of part of the prediction. It's going to be ran by natural laws, and it's going to be populated with rational beings. So Christianity actually does have some good predictability there. But when you go to atheism, now, don't let Alex get away with too much. In his quote, he says, what would we expect to find if we assume there is no God and animals in nature? Then he goes on to say things. But why would we expect that there would be animals existing in an atheistic universe? If you look at the arguments from fine tuning for the existence of God, I know that the probability of sentient, self-aware life, more advanced life, is just astronomical, beyond impossible. But it isn't. Aren't the odds of a world that can sustain life, isn't that like astronomical as well? You know, if I assumed that there was no God, then if you're really going to ask my opinion, I would assume that I'm going to be looking at a lifeless universe. I'm not just going to assume there's going to be animals on it. So I don't think that it has as much explanatory power as he thinks it does. Yes, you know, a world with animals dying could be a possibility, but that's the thing. If atheism, what Paul Draper, or naturalism, what Paul Draper would call the no design hypothesis, it's the theory that things in nature have no purpose. That actually doesn't predict anything, does it? Like, you can't even, you know what I'm saying? Like, any world I would observe would be what I would expect according to the no design hypothesis, because if nothing has a purpose, then I can't really predict any given world. So I would say that the fact that there's sentient, self-aware life on this planet, it would give theism more predictive power, more explanatory power, and animal suffering. You know, like I said, if you get into those gnomic regularity or the hierarchy of being arguments, there it really does seem like God would have good reasons to include animal death and suffering in creation.
Kyle, let me ask you this. How much of this issue, and I think this goes for Alex and for our young earth friends who hold to the and SES, by the way, is neither young earth or old earth officially. We have professors, students who are both. But I'm thinking specifically like Answers in Genesis kind of mentality that really hangs their hat on this, you know, no death before the fall and those kind of things. How much of this whole issue is related to just simply a misunderstanding of what good actually means, whether it be a good God that Alex talks about or that Christians talk about all the time, or what it means for animals to be good and whether it's good for them to die or not.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So, and that's really, and I guess this is probably why you thought of that as I was explaining it, wasn't it? Because when, especially with the medieval, Aquinas following Augustine, they defined evil as a privation of the good. And in a lot of medieval thought, a lot of classical theistic thought, good means when something is what it ought to be. And it seems like, yes, that's a great point, because I actually had to interact with young earth creationists in my book, because it seemed to me like they were making a formulation of the problem of animal suffering, but just from a different perspective. But yeah, the young earth creationists, when they see, and I don't want to put everybody in the same boat, but like authors like Ken Ham, at least will say that. I don't want to say that they're all saying this, but a lot of times they say, okay, so whenever Genesis says that God saw that everything was good, that necessarily means that there was no death there, right? You see Alex in the video saying that, yeah, if I would expect a world that was made by an all-loving, all-powerful, all-good God to not have any animal death, or at least not have as much animal death in it, right? And it's basically it's kind of two sides of the same coin, right? A good world is going to be one where everybody lives forever and doesn't experience pain at all. But yeah, kind of, answering that young earth idea, what, when you start to ask what is good, what is goodness, one thing I dealt with in the book, in my book, was that pain actually is a good thing. And that might make me sound like a crazy person, But I say that because pain is something that exists and it is there for a reason, and that's to keep you alive. So, from a Thomistic perspective, because pain is a thing in reality, and because it has a purpose and it keeps you alive, it is actually a good thing. But yeah, kind of getting to that, if God intended for animals to be here for human beings, and He intended them to die, like in the Bible, He allows human beings to eat them for food. That would actually mean that a good animal isn't one that lives forever. That would be good for that particular animal. But if he means for these animals to serve a certain purpose and they serve that purpose, then they are good. And it would be okay it would make sense for him to say, this is good, even though there was death in creation. So it's a little presumptuous uh, for us to look and say, yeah, animal death, like, I mean, it makes sense, right? When you do have something that exists in a really great way and then it passes away, that's a privation of its being. But Aquinas would say, there's not every privation of a good is an evil. It's only when it's a privation of a good that ought to be there that it's an evil, right? So being blind would be evil because you're supposed to have human beings are supposed to have sight, but a rock not having sight wouldn't be evil because it's not meant to have it. So an argument is, yes, obviously we can conceive that God has the power to make everything live forever. But does that necessarily mean that we know for certain that He wants everything to live forever? If He meant for animals to die in the way that they do, then that's a good thing because that they're living up to what they're supposed to do, living and dying up to what they're supposed to do.
Well, I mean, the psalmist praises God for providing prey for the lion. God providing the prey.
Yes, and I personally, there's metaphysical reasons and epistemological reasons, and I talk about this in the book, for saying that we don't think that we can, know what God ought to do in every single situation. But I worry about especially Christian philosophers or Christian theologians, at least, saying that, yeah, we know that God would do this. God would be evil. That's what really gets me worried, is when the young earth creationists like Ken Ham start saying God would be an evil God if He allowed animal death. And I just want to be like, hold on now. If He means for them to die, then that would be it would make sense because that's how they ought to exist, that would be a good thing. Just because an animal passes away doesn't necessarily mean it's an evil. So I just worry about them because they're in a sense, the young earth Christians like Kim Ham have formulated a problem of evil from animal suffering, because they're saying that if God allowed animal suffering, then He would be evil. So basically the God of theism wouldn't exist. And obviously what they're saying, though, is that it was all caused by Adam and Eve. It's not like they're saying God doesn't exist. But if you look in the natural history of the universe, and you are compelled by the evidence that animals have been dying, then according to their logic, you have to assume that God, the God of classical theism, does not exist. You can't have animals' death before Adam and Eve 6,000 or 10,000 years ago and the God of classical theism, according to their argument. So that was one thing I try to talk about in the book as well.
Yeah. Well, even for Alex, and I know we're not going to get to everything we wanted to today. We're running out of time, but just to kind of to bring it full circle, even for Alex and his arguments, or young earth creationists or whatever.
Yeah.
This is why I love, again, this systematic metaphysical way of thinking about these issues, because everything is interconnected. So when we understand what good is, and that is what causes the thing to fulfill its purpose, its teleology, to use the philosophical term, and we understand that love is to will the good of another. And like you said, if it is one of the goals towards which animals are directed to die, for example, I'm really glad cows die, because I love the steak I had the other day. Then it is not unloving for God to allow those things to happen, and it all becomes interconnected, even with the deer in the forest fire or the tree falling on his leg,
Yeah.
like you mentioned at the beginning. The regularities in which we expect this universe to operate mean that things like forest fires will happen because wood is combustible, or that trees will fall because
Yeah.
soil is not indestructible matter that a tree will never fall out
Yeah.
of. It's
And also, I mean, I just don't know where you draw the line,
exactly.
because they'll say, well, why didn't he let them just die instantly, or why can't they just not feel pain? But we know that if animals and human beings didn't feel pain, rarely anybody would make it to adulthood
We'll just look at a
without the ability to feel
diabetic.
pain. Yeah, pain is a good thing. Without it, we would
That's right.
die
That's right.
way sooner. So it really doesn't boil down to why do we experience pain. That is what I would expect for God to make if He wants a finite universe with finite creatures in it.
Hmm.
The bigger question is, why does He do that? And that's what a lot of the literature that He wasn't mentioning interacts with.
Hmm.
Do we have time to look over the clip where He talks about animal minds, and his last one about what would happen if animals couldn't experience pain?
We may have to save those for the next episode. We can certainly do a part two. That would be great. And
Okay.
maybe we can dive into more specifics of your book, actually, if you're open to doing that, and
Sure.
interacting
Oh
with some
yeah,
of
I mean,
the specific things.
I just wanted to at least say like just a couple
Please, yeah,
things
go
about it.
ahead.
It talks about in the video, if you know what you're listening to, Craig gives a neo-Cartesian response. He mentions Michael Murray. In Michael Murray's book, he talks about a position called neo-Cartesianism, and it's this idea that there's four levels to it. Some people think that animals don't experience anything, so like they're not conscious at all. They react to the world, but they're like philosophical zombies. There's no consciousness, know what it is like to be an animal. But there's more levels to it that Murray argues for. In my book, I argue that animal suffering isn't morally relevant because animals aren't self-aware. Okay. And in the video, Alex says, that sounds absurd to me. But the thing is that I think that's another reason why he might enjoy diving deeper into this. And if you look at the literature in comparative psychology, one thing I found is that researchers make a distinction between consciousness and awareness. Consciousness is a passive experience of the world. Awareness is an active experience of the world. And, surprise, surprise, this was a distinction that Aristotle and Aquinas made, but it's also something backed up by contemporary science. But what we're saying, what like the Thomistic Aristotelian view would be, we're saying that animals are experiencing pain passively. It's they're conscious of pain. But because and Alex admitted this, because they're not rational, and according to the Aristotelian Thomistic view, because if you're not rational, it means you don't have a rational soul, and it means that you can't survive the death of your body. It basically means that you're not human. Because they don't have a rational soul, they don't have this active awareness of the world. And because they don't have this active awareness, they're not aware. They don't know things. They're not aware of them. They're not aware of their pain. They're conscious of their pain. They're not aware of it. And they're not aware of themselves as individuals. An easy way to explain it is to think about when you're driving to work. Have you ever driven to work and when you got there, you're like, I have no idea how I got here? It was probably because you're thinking about something. Your awareness was on some abstract problem you were thinking about the whole drive to work. Your consciousness was actually on the road and the world around you. But that was passive. And obviously you're experiencing the world in some sense of the word because you actually drove to work. You hit the gas, you hit the brake every time you're supposed to, you turn the steering wheel. But when you think back on it, you can't remember any of it. And it's because you were conscious of the world, but you weren't aware of the world. And that's the distinction we're dealing with. And when we think of animals and we think what it would be like to be a zebra being burned in a forest fire, I think it's going to be impossible for us to think what it is like to be a zebra, because when we're doing that, we're casting our awareness upon this issue. and and anything that we picture is going to be like a self-aware being going through suffering. We just don't know what it's like to be conscious of the world but not be self-aware of the world and ourselves as individuals. So there's a lot of distinctions that he needs to interact with before he can just brush it away in a YouTube video. And at the end, he goes on to say that if animals didn't experience suffering and it wasn't morally relevant, then we could just do whatever we want to. And at that point in the video, I'm like, that must be what it's like whenever they, because atheists, with good reason, I think, they get upset when Christians say, well, if you don't believe in God, it just means that you can do whatever you want. So, I shouldn't even trust you because you can just murder me for no reason. Well, it's kind of the same thing. Just because animals don't experience suffering like humans do, that doesn't give Christians or anybody free reign to do whatever they want to animals. Especially according to Christianity, we're supposed to be stewards of creation. So just because an animal doesn't experience morally relevant suffering doesn't mean I can just start putting screws into it because I think it's funny. I still need to take care of all the gifts that God gave me, especially knowing that God put animals on the planet for human flourishing and human companionship and for the good of human beings. So of course I can't just all of a sudden start doing whatever I want to animals. We need to have a common sense stewardship.
Well, Kyle, this has been fascinating. There's so many rabbit trails to chase and so many other issues that we could dive so much more deeply in, and perhaps we will in future episodes. But I appreciate the work you're doing. Again, we've been talking with Dr. Kyle Keltz, SES alum and author of Thomism and the Problem of Animal Suffering. So, Kyle, again, I really appreciate your time and sharing with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on again, Adam. I almost feel weird when I say I'm excited to talk about it. It's a weird subject, talk about pain and animal suffering, but it really is an important topic.
It is.
And I do like to, try to dive deeper into it and help people think more about it and dig into those distinctions. So thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. And where can people go to learn more about your blog and just the things that you're doing?
Oh yeah. Well, I've got my my academic website. It's bkylekeltz.com, bkylekeltz.com. It's got a lot of my work on there. You can look at articles I've published and access those for free. My dissertation, which was published as a book, is Thomism and the Problem of Animal Suffering. You can get that on Amazon, Christian Book, Barnes and Noble. It's at whipandstock.com. You can get it as a Kindle book. So that's all over the place. Just my academic website, bkylekeltz. And as you said, I've been on a few podcasts, but all of that is on my website. There's links to those things. So if people want to dig into the problem, there's plenty of resources on there that they can look at.
Awesome. Well, again, we appreciate your time and thanks for the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Take care.
You too. God bless.
Once again, that was Dr. Kyle Keltz, SES alum and author of Thomism and the Problem of Animal Suffering. So if you're interested in these types of issues, if you're interested in the philosophy and the theology behind these kind of issues, and of course the apologetic value that understanding these issues can bring you, I would certainly encourage you to check out Southern Evangelical Seminary and Bible College. As an alum myself, I can't say enough about how life-changing it is to understand some of these philosophical issues that really underpin so many of these other things that we talk about that have theological and apologetic implications. So you can visit degrees.ses.edu/podcast, degrees.ses.edu/podcast, where you can download a free ebook that will explain a little bit more about the uniquely integrated approach to theology, philosophy, and apologetics that we take at SES. And of course, none of this happens without your support, both prayerfully and financially. So you can visit ses.edu to learn more about how you can partner with us. If you're listening to this close to the actual recording date, we certainly would encourage you to prayerfully consider a year-end gift by the end of June. That would certainly help the seminary go a long way in fulfilling our mission to equip students to proclaim, engage, and defend the gospel. So again, ses.edu. As always, we call this show Why Do You Believe? And the only reason to believe anything is because it's true. So go share truth with someone today.
Providing an integrated approach to theology, philosophy, and apologetics that will equip you to proclaim the gospel, engage the culture, and defend the truth. That's SES.